This is a 2004 Nissan 350Z, and it's one of my favorite sports cars from the 2000s. This isn't as crazy now, but back when it came out, it was a huge deal. It signaled the return of the powerful Japanese sports car. And today, I'm going to review it. Before I get started, big news, this Z is currently live for sale, being auctioned on Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website. This Z is a roadster, as you can see, with a manual transmission and less than 17,000 miles, and this fantastic color. It's a great example of an early Z, and you can buy it on Cars and Bids. So, once you're done watching this video, click the link in the description below to head over to the live auction for this 350Z Roadster, where you can bid on it and buy it only on carsandbids.com. But let's talk Z. This car came out back in 2003. I was 15 years old, and I still remember how cool it was. Nissan was bringing back the Z. This was an especially big deal because just a decade earlier, all the Japanese sports cars were getting canceled. The Mitsubishi 3000 GT, the Nissan 300ZX, the Supra, of course, the RX-7, the Subaru SVX, all gone. The Acura NSX remained, but without any significant attention from Honda. It was just sort of rolling on and getting old. Only the Honda S2000 really prevailed as a Japanese sports car from this era, but as a little four-cylinder roadster, not like the Japanese muscle cars from 10 years earlier. And then the Z reappeared, and it was a huge deal. 287 horsepower. That was the same as the Acura NSX at the time, and approaching the BMW M3 with 330 horses, except this was way cheaper and actually reliable. The Z was incredibly popular in its first few years back, and it was a hugely successful revival of a beloved car. Over the years, the allure has gone from the Z, as Nissan hasn't really kept it fresh and modern. The newer models are just not that competitive, but I still remember back in 2003 when this car was everything. And today, we're going to take a little trip back in time and review it. First, I'll show you all the quirks and features of the 350Z, then I'll get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a Doug score. Alright, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the Z with getting in, and that means starting with the door handle, which is always a bit of a controversy with this car. When you revive an important car like this, it's not just about getting the performance right, you also have to get the design right, and a lot of people didn't like how the door handle looked. It was always silver, never body colored, and it was sort of sticking off the door. People thought it looked like ears, and then it was kind of a weird addition to the car. Frankly, I never minded it, although I can understand the criticism. I do like how it operates though. It's mounted vertically, so you open it like with the same swing as the door. You stick your hand inside, pull, and then the door opens. But before we climb inside, one thing to note with the door handle, you see how there are 3 squares positioned on the door handle? Those are like the Z squares, if you will. They appear in all of the Z badging. You can see them on the middle section of the Z, 3 little squares, and Nissan took great care to subtly integrate those Z squares into various parts of the car, which I will show you throughout this tour. But anyway, let's climb inside the Z. Now, the first thing you notice when you go to climb inside the Z, there are a lot of Z logos in this interior. You can see 3 of them the moment you open the door. 1 on the steering wheel, 1 on the floor mat, and 1 on the door sill. Nissan really wanted to emphasize that the Z is back, so there's logos everywhere. And on the door sill, you can also see the Z in the center, flanked on each side by those 3 little squares. I told you they'd be appearing in various places. Keep an eye out for more of them. But there really are Z logos everywhere throughout this car. There's even one on this little vent next to the dashboard. You can see it's molded into a Z, and the crazy thing is that vent is not visible when the door is closed. You close the door, you drive the car, you won't see that Z. It's only visible when the door is open, that hidden extra Z. There are so many Z logos in this car that you can't even see some of them. But anyway, next up we move fully inside the Z, and the first thing you notice when you look in this interior is the seat. We'll get to the seat color in a second, but I want to talk about the material. The inside is mesh, which is really strange, but that's the material they went with. Certainly a very distinctive seating choice for the 350Z. Now, also weird about this seat, the controls for the seat are on the inside. Next to the transmission tunnel in the center console, you have these little switches, and those are what you use to move the seat forward or backwards and to adjust it, which is odd they're not over by the door. Instead, on the outside of the seat, you have this little storage panel, which is kind of a strange spot, but it's actually useful because the door panel itself doesn't really have that much storage, only this little area, so you get a little extra storage with your seat and your controls are relocated. Kind of strange, but that's how they did it. And by the way, speaking of the door panel, over on the passenger side, the door panel has a little grab handle you can hold on to while you're going on the racetrack, and you'll notice if you look closely, 3 little squares on the grab handle to match the subtle little squares everywhere else. Those were the Z squares. But anyway, next interesting Z interior item, let's talk lowering the roof. Now, in order to do this, you gotta be stopped, you gotta have your foot on the brake, and the car has to be in neutral. Once you're there, you can then unlatch the roof manually at sort of the top of the windshield, as you can see, and then there's a little button to the left of the steering wheel. It says open or close. You press open, and then the roof goes down. And as you can see, it's kind of a complicated process, actually. A few different things have to happen. The back comes up, of course, the roof does a little dance, and then it goes down. But this car did have a power-operated soft top, which was kind of nice. The Mazda Miata, the Honda S2000, they were manual tops, so this was a little bit more luxurious than those. Now, to put the roof back up, of course, the procedure basically goes in the exact opposite way. You start with the little switch over to the left of the wheel, you press close, and then the top closes itself up to the windshield, where then you will manually latch it in place, and then you're good to go. And by the way, one interesting thing about that roof latching procedure, take a look at that latch again. You notice 3 little squares? Those would be the Z squares making their appearance once again, reminding you of your Z-ness even on the roof latch. Next up, another rather quirky retractable thing in this interior is the navigation system screen. If you look in the center control stack, you will see your radio controls and your climate controls, and then like a little box with a button. If you press that button, it retracts and shows you your navigation screen. And as you can see, look at it again, it doesn't just pop backwards, it has like an electronic retracting mechanism that pulls it backwards to reveal the nav screen. This is very strange. Your navigation screen isn't displayed unless you want it displayed when you open it up and take it out of its little box, and then you have your screen there. Now, this is just a navigation system. It doesn't incorporate any other car functions. It's navigation only, so maybe you just didn't want to look at it. You could just close the box and pretend it wasn't there. It's kind of crazy to imagine that now compared to modern car infotainment screens that run the entire car. You could never like close them up because they're so important. Well, back then, when it was just a nav screen, you could put it away if you wanted. But anyway, since we're on the center control stack, moving on to a few other interesting items in here. I really like these gauges at the top of the control stack. You have these 3 driver-focused gauges, which made sense in a sports car: battery voltage, oil pressure, and the one on the left had a little screen in it. And you could adjust what was being displayed there with this little button on the side of the gauge cluster. You'd press that, and the screen would show like the temperature, your fuel range, your trip odometer, your gas mileage, and it would even display your current speed digitally, which is kind of cool. A lot of cars didn't have that back then, but you could do it in the Z. But anyway, onto the gauge cluster. Interesting thing here, right in the center, you have the tachometer, not the speedometer. The tach is right there because that's the most important gauge when you're on the racetrack, which is where everyone was taking their 350Zs. That does look sort of performance-y and cool. Another weird thing about the gauge cluster, when you put on the turn signals, they light up in these little circles, but the turn signal arrow doesn't light up. Instead, the space around the arrow lights up, which is just sort of an interesting little quirk, something only true car quirk geeks will appreciate, but it is kind of interesting to see that choice. And by the way, also in this area with the door closed, you can see the vent situation on the door. Earlier, I mentioned that little vent with the Z on it gets covered up when the door is closed, and that's because it is pushing air through the door and into a climate vent in the door. They did that to save space in this interior. Rather than put climate vents on the side of the dashboard, they integrated them into the doors in order to save space on the dashboard. One interesting thing with these climate vents, in addition to them being in the doors, they directly face the door handle, which is hollowed out, probably in part so that air can blow through it and onto you so that they can be useful and effective climate vents. So the climate vent and the door handle actually have to kind of work in tandem here, which is something you don't usually see. Now, when it comes to maximizing space, like sticking the climate vents in the doors, this car was fantastic. It was really great at maximizing interior space. For example, you look around this interior, you don't see any cigarette lighter or cigarette lighter outlet. That's because it's hidden underneath the passenger side of the dashboard, this little cutout, you pull on it, and that's your cigarette lighter, hidden instead of taking up valuable space in the middle. And there's a second cigarette lighter between the seats behind them. This little panel opens up, and it's a second cigarette lighter outlet. So you have those in here, but not in the usual places in order to save space. And here's another interesting and clever use of space. Behind the passenger seat, there's this little panel. You push on it, it drops down and reveals a little storage area. Not huge, not anything you put a lot of stuff in, but it's there for a little extra storage and a little extra practicality in the Z. Now, you only had that behind the passenger seat. Behind the driver's seat, you had the DVD slot for the navigation system, so only one of those little space areas behind the seats, but it's there, which is kind of cool. And another creative use of space in this car, you look around this interior and there are no cup holders, or at least immediately visible ones. They've integrated one again on the passenger side of the dashboard. You press on this little compartment and a cup holder pops out. Looks kind of flimsy, wouldn't necessarily trust it, but it's there, which is better than no cup holder at all. And by the way, one other interesting quirk, before I climb out, between the seats you have a little piece of glass behind them. That's the wind deflector to make sure wind sort of blows over the cabin and doesn't create a windstorm in here. And you can see it has the Z on it with the 3 Z dots, appearing pretty much everywhere Nissan could put it. And next up we move outside the Z, and I want to talk color. Now this car is finished in this beautiful kind of goldish, copperish, orangish, and it looks great. This was the launch color in a lot of the early press advertisements for the 350Z, and I loved it. It really helped revive this car with kind of a splash. Although it's worth noting this color wasn't really unique. In the early 2000s, this color was hot, and a lot of cars used this in their press materials. The Cadillac CTS debuted in this color around this same time, and so did the Pontiac GTO. The Chevy Corvette, the C6, had a color that was very similar to this one. Other automakers used similar colors too. The Mazda 6 had a color very similar to this right in the early 2000s, and the Dodge Viper also had a similar color. This was a popular 2000s color, apparently. And Nissan used this color in other models like the Maxima at the time, and the Murano very famously had this color. Now the interesting thing about this car is the color carries on to the interior. You can see the seats are also this kind of orangish, sort of peanut butterish color that somewhat matches the exterior, and that was a weird decision, although it's worth noting Nissan did that in other cars too. There was an Infiniti FX SUV that debuted in this copper exterior with an orange interior, and in that car it was a lot of orange and copper, but in this one it just looked cool. But anyway, next up, we move on to some other notable 350Z quirks and features, starting with the trunk. Now get back here, you press the little trunk icon on the key fob, it pops it open, and then you can lift it open from there. Now the trunk was interesting in that it didn't share any space with the convertible top. The top had its own area, the trunk had its own area, so you could load the trunk without worrying if you'd still be able to get the top down, because the trunk was always the same size regardless of whether you had the top up or down. Now the trunk, you can see, not really all that big back here, although you can get a golf bag in this trunk, and Nissan even provides you a little diagram explaining exactly how to set it up so the golf bag will fit, specifically for a golf bag, because for years that was a standard size that American car reviewers would use to describe how big a cargo area was. And yes, you can get a golf bag in the Z. But anyway, another interesting quirk back here is rear lighting, which I always found kind of strange in this car. For one thing, the turn signal is completely independent of the taillight. You have this rather large taillight assembly, but it only has the taillight and the brake light. The turn signal and reverse light are down in the bumper, as you can see, completely separate. Now, as for the taillight itself, to me, that was the only drawback of the car's design. I never liked how far it kind of reached into the body of the car. I always thought it went just a little bit too far and looked a little bit weird, but that's how they designed it, and that's how it looks. But anyway, Anyway, next we move on to the front of the Z, and I want to talk lighting for a second, specifically the reflectors, because there's a rather interesting quirk with the reflector situation up here. Now, the US government mandates that all cars have a front orange reflector mounted somewhere on the front side and a rear red one. Now, most automakers try to hide this and conceal it as much as they can because it's not very attractive, but the Z has two. You can see one on the side of the headlight and then another one integrated into the bumper. There's a lot of reflector here, and I've always wondered why they did that, and I've always speculated that it was probably because the one in the headlight isn't quite side mounted enough. If you look at it, it's kind of flat and upright, almost like it's facing forward, which maybe didn't meet the requirement. And I wonder if Nissan got to the point of making this car, found out that reflector wouldn't meet the requirement, but they had already designed the headlight, and so they added a second reflector into the side of the bumper, and so that's why there are two. That's just speculation, but it's the only reason I can think of why you would want two massive reflectors on the front side of the car. Very interesting either way. And finally, we move under the hood where you can see the engine. 287 horsepower, 3.5 liter V6, the famous VQ V6 that Nissan put in so many of its vehicles. It was such a well-known and well-loved engine, and it had big power in this car. 287 doesn't seem like a lot by modern standards, but this had more power than a V8 Mustang GT at the time. The Camaro was no longer in production when the Z came out, so there was no comparison there, but this had way more power than the Honda S2000, and like I said, the same power as an Acura NSX. This was a big deal in this car back then. And like I said, it signified sort of the return of the real Japanese muscle car after they had gone away 10 years ago. And within a few years of this car coming out, you had the Evo on the market, the Subaru STI, the Mazda RX-8. Cars were starting to make a return, and this was sort of the forefather of a lot of those. Another big benefit of this powertrain was it was reliable. It didn't have as much power as a V8 Audi S4 or a BMW M3, but it had way less problems than those cars, and it wasn't anywhere near as expensive to buy one of these. So this had performance that was similar, but just less issues, and that's why these have survived in such large numbers almost 20 years after they came out, and that's why this car was such a smash hit at the time. Big power for not crazy money, looked great, the revival of a great brand name, and a reliable V6 under the hood. It was a big win. Now, unfortunately, after this car, interest in sports cars kind of started to die off again. Nissan redesigned the Z and they made the 350Z in like 2008-09, but after that, there just weren't enough sales for Nissan to continue to justify investing in the car, and it kind of languished on the market. They're about to revive it. There will be a new Z car out soon, and I hope it does really well, but I still remember what an impact this made when it came out almost 20 years ago now. And so those are the quirks and features of the Nissan 350Z. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the Z. Listen to that VQ engine. That engine note was everywhere in about 2005. Every Infiniti G you'd hear go by and you'd look up thinking it was something cool, and it was an Infiniti G, which was cool, but not, you know. So, Z. First off, first impression driving this car, it still feels great. Now this one is super, super low mileage, and so it's been really babied. It hasn't had time to, well, for one thing, get like destroyed with modifications. People did a lot of crazy stuff to these cars. And also just a lot of components haven't had time to wear. And I mention that because the shifter just feels great. Like incredibly short throws, incredibly tight. It feels like a good new car. I'm actually pretty impressed with it. And it's the same deal with the clutch. The clutch and shifter action is fantastic. The clutch is great, very linear, very smooth, and the shifter is very easy to use, throw it into gear. It honestly feels almost Porsche-like in the way that it shifts, which is pretty impressive. And of course, you have that great exhaust note, which was really famous on these Nissan and Infiniti models with this engine back in the day, and you can hear it and it sounds good. It always sounded good. That's why everybody kind of got annoyed with it. It was like, oh, this is you're seeing some exotic car, and then you look up and it was this. Now, the thing about this car that was really always great to me, there were a bunch of things, and I've kind of covered them all, but it was quick. And it still feels pretty quick. Now, it's not like it was back then. It still moves. I mean, this is a fast car. It's not quite like it was back then. Back in the day, when this came out in 03, this was like crazy, that you could get this kind of performance for this money. If you didn't want a Mustang, I mean, this was smaller and sportier. You know, back then the Mustang still had that reputation of being a car that only went in a straight line. Well, this thing had more power than a V8 Mustang, and it could turn, and it was not expensive, and it was reliable. I mean, there were so many benefits to this car. And I just remember when I was a kid, this thing coming out and being like a total top dog in the sports car world at that time, when there was some question as to whether the sports car world was really going to prevail, especially in terms of affordable sports cars. The other thing about this car that's pretty impressive, and it's not unique to this one, but again, it's a benefit of this one being low mileage and not that worn. The suspension, steering, and handling are incredible with this car. They feel fantastic. The steering feel is just great. It's heavy. Which is unusual from this era. A lot of cars, they were starting to get into more, over-assisted steering feels. Automakers thought they could dial these cars. They knew better than like a real hydraulic steering feel. And this car just has this great heavy steering feel where you feel like you're the one who's really doing the work and positioning the car, which is great. The car also just reacts very quickly to any direction changes. It handles very sharply, it turns very quickly. It's a surprisingly fun and exciting car to kind of throw around. And it's interesting, I think one of the things about this car that's lost a little bit, they made a zillion of these, and you still see them everywhere because it was a reliable motor and they were desirable cars. And I think one of the things that's lost a little bit is that it's actually a pretty good car. People kind of got tired of seeing these in the G35s. It was almost a default choice if you wanted a sports car at this time. It was faster than an S2000. It could do more in terms of cornering and handling than a Mustang. It was more reliable than an M3. There were so many reasons to get this that like everybody did. And this was the days before the Challenger. There was no Camaro. Like, this was it. And this is just a fantastic version of this car. Stick shift. I always prefer convertibles. People are always like, oh, the coupe is more rigid. I'm like, okay, slow down there, Nigel Mansell. We're not driving this thing on a track. For most people, you get more benefit out of having the open roof than you do the rigidity of a coupe. But I love this car, and I still do. And I know it's not quite the same impact that it was back then, but I still remember how cool it was. And frankly, I think it still feels fast, and it still drives well, even almost 20 years later. And so that's the 350Z. This car isn't as amazing or groundbreaking as it was back when it came out. The technology is old, the performance isn't quite as insane as it seemed back then, and the styling isn't quite as fresh anymore. But there's still a lot here. There's still a spark, an excitement to this car that I've always loved, and it's still a manual transmission car with decent power, rear-wheel drive, and reliability. I have always loved this Generation Z, and I'm thrilled I had the chance to check out such a nice example, which you can buy on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give the Z a Doug score. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the 350Z was a handsome car. I always preferred the look of the coupe, but the convertible was still nice enough, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Acceleration 0 to 60 was in the low 5-second range, so it gets a 5 out of 10. Handling is good, though not quite as sharp as the RX-8 or the S2000, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Fun factor is good, as these were fast and exciting and cool, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Cool factor is decent, although I think these will get cooler as they age, and it gets harder to find nice ones, and it gets a 6 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 29 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. The Z is reasonably well equipped for its time period, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Comfort is normal for a car like this, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Quality is good. The powertrain is reliable, and interior materials are nice enough, especially for the price point, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Practicality, two-seater car with a small trunk, gets a 2 out of 10. Value is great, as these are reliable, fast, fun, cool, and frankly, I think they're undervalued given all they offer. It gets a 7 out of 10 for a total daily score of 24 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 53 out of 100, which places it here against rivals. The 350Z falls short of the E46 M3 and the S2000, which are more fun, and the 2004 WRX STI, which is more practical, but it ties the fantastic Mazda RX-8, and it holds its own in this group. The 350Z is an exciting car, and I still think they're cool all these years later. Those were the Z squares. Thank you, yeah.